Welcome to the Joys of Binge Reading, the show for anyone who ever got to the end of a great book and wanted to read the next instalment. We interview successful series authors and recommend the best in mystery, suspense, historical and romance series, so you'll never be without a book you can't put down. You'll find this episode's show notes, a free ebook and lots more information at thejoysofbingereading.com. And now, here's our show.
Rennie Airth's gentleman detective John Madden investigates complex multiple murders in a Britain in turmoil during and after 2 world wars. It's a series that includes serial killer cases long before the phrase serial killer was ever invented. Hi there, I'm your host Jenny Wheeler, and today Rennie talks about having lunch with his hero Graham Greene and why he learnt more from writing a bad book than a good one. But before we talk to Rennie, just a reminder, the show notes for this binge reading episode can be found on the website thejoysofbingereading.com. That's where you'll find a full transcript of our chat, plus links to Rennie's books and website, as well as details about how to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss future episodes. But now, here's Rennie. Hello there, Rennie, and welcome to the show. It's great to have you with us.
It's very nice to be talking to you, Jenny.
Now, look, I always like to start with this question because it seems appropriate for storytellers to begin at the beginning and ask, was there a kind of once upon a time moment, a catalyst moment when you thought to yourself, if I don't get round to writing fiction now, I'm never going to do it? And if there was a moment like that, what was the catalyst for it?
Yes, that's an interesting question. Well, I actually always, I think, wanted to write fiction. That is, when I was at school, I thought of myself as one day being a writer, but I hadn't got anything to write about then. So I went into journalism and had actually a very interesting first career. I worked in various parts of the world, but it was when I got to Vietnam. I was working there for Reuters, and I'd done a stint there, and then it was a matter of either staying with Reuters and going to some other possibly interesting place, or looking for a job for a newspaper on a newspaper, or doing what I'd actually wanted to do now for some years, write fiction. So I quit Reuters and went to Crete, of all places, where I had some sort of connection, thinking I would write a book there and see how it went. And that's how it actually started. The book I wrote there actually was no good. It was never published. But you actually learn a lot from actually writing a bad book, I think, perhaps more than writing one that's accepted. But that's what actually got me into writing. Yes.
Yes, and was it anything to do with your post in Vietnam that sort of made you think, I want to do this now?
Not at all, only in the sense that I felt I'd had some very interesting stuff to cover. I'd been in Washington during the Kennedy years. I'd been in Cuba and I met Castro, did all those sorts of things. And Vietnam was a big story. I just wondered if I hadn't actually at that time done the best kind of stories there were, and did I want to hang on, or was this a moment to sort of, break off and write fiction? So, but it wasn't anything that happened to me in Vietnam, no.
Okay, good. And then, I don't know if that first book you wrote was a historical crime thriller, but that's the area that you now seem to have settled in. What made you choose that particular genre? And I wonder if you actually object to being thought of as a genre writer.
No, I don't mind being thought of as a genre writer, and I didn't actually sit down with the idea of saying I'm going to be a genre writer. I got very interested in the First World War. I'd read a lot about it. And I just got the idea of, in fact, doing it actually came as a two-pronged idea. One, to actually write a story set around that time involving a man who'd been in the war and come out of it. And the other was to, serial killers have been very popular in fiction. And I thought, how about doing a story about a serial killer before that term was actually coined and people didn't really understand it. And so Madden and his superior, Chief Inspector Sinclair, have to figure out what's going on. I thought it was a nice challenge to take on.
Yes, exactly. And you have mentioned on your website that there was a scrapbook in your family that was left behind by an uncle who was killed in World War I that also helped to feed into that inspiration for River of Darkness. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I can, actually. He was my father's elder brother. They were both in the war. My uncle, who had my name, same name as I had, Rennie, was was killed in the war, and my father was captured. And the thing is, the telegrams are sent to their parents. This all happened in the same week. So my grandparents had two telegrams. One of them saying that their elder son was dead, and the other that their younger son was missing. Can you imagine what they must have felt then? Anyway, they put together a
terrible, yeah.
Yeah, they must have felt terrible, and this was common in England. This wasn't just it wasn't just them. They put together a scrapbook which was very touching. There was old photographs of my uncle, who was rather who sort of liked amateur dramatics, who was something of a joker, very good cricketer at school apparently. And there were just these very touching family pictures. There was a letter from his commanding officer saying, "Oh, we like Rennie so much, and he was such a good chap." He'd actually spent 2 years in the trenches and survived, and came out with his nerves, I think, in bad shape. But there was such pressure then to sort of do your bit that he volunteered to be an RAF observer, and his plane was shot down and he was killed. That's how he died. And all these little notes and bits about him, and the tests he had to take as an observer, and all the ticks, rather like having a school report, good, good, satisfactory. And I was just very moved by it, and it sort of played into the idea I had of writing a book about that time. Yes. The other thing was my father never spoke about the war very much, and this I discovered by reading about the war was actually quite common. When troops came back from the Second World War, they had lots of stories about the war, about what had happened to them, where they'd been. This wasn't so much the case of the First World War, which was so awful, trapped in the trenches for years, and the sort of death toll was so awful that men coming back didn't want to talk about very much, but even more to the point, people back in England didn't want to hear about it. So I think this was partly why my father never talked about it at all.
Yes, yes. For those not familiar with your protagonist, Detective John Madden, in book one, he's clearly suffering from some sort of stress, obviously partly caused by the fact that he lost his wife and daughter, but also battle fatigue. This is something that's come under various names. But I wonder if your experiences in Vietnam had also made you a little bit more sensitive to that whole area of whatever you call it, post-Vietnam syndrome, or...
Yes, I see what you mean. No, I don't think so, because that thing in Vietnam, the PTSD, it only came up sometime later. I would say quite early on in the conflict, 65, 66. All the American forces arriving were in fact very fresh and new. I think the sort of elite divisions arrived first, the Marines and the airborne thing, and that aspect of the war didn't arise then. It came later. So the answer is no, it didn't really have any effect on me. I was really referring to books I'd read about the effect on men who'd come back from the First World War. And even at the time my book is set in 1923, there were still thousands of men in hospital being treated for the after effects of what was called, as you know, shell shock or something like that then.
Yes.
And Madden was one of those cases, but he hadn't needed to go to hospital. He was a very strong man, strong-willed, but he was in bad shape until he met Helen, who was, as you know, instrumental in sort of helping him and curing him.
Yes, yes. And then the next book in the series jumps forward 20 years.
Actually, no, Jenny, you're wrong there, 10 years.
10 years, okay.
It's 23 to 33.
Oh, that's right.
It jumps forward to 33.
Yeah. That's right. So it was set between the wars as fascism is on the rise. That's also breaking with the kind of genre trope where you have a detective who then is set in his setting and just takes the next case. You change his circumstances entirely. He's now left the police force. He's married to Helen. He's a gentleman farmer. So you've got a really different setup for the second story, and that kind of carries on right through the whole series. That was an iconoclastic approach, really, wasn't it, to genre fiction?
Yes, it was. I wanted to do something different. I think the sort of series of detective stories, some of them are very good, of course, but you tend to think that they sort of tend to live rather in a bubble. It's another case for Inspector so-and-so, and then they sort of go through rather familiar routines. I wanted to place these books in a different historical context each time. and of course tying in the second book with the rise of fascism and all Madden's hatred of war coming to his mind again, and he thinks about these things. And then during the war, when he had to go into the Home Guard for a bit, but hated putting on uniform, I was playing on that sort of trope all the time. Yeah, but I like the idea of also looking at the English class system, English society, how people behaved, and of course it changes during the books as they move on.
Just as an aside, have you spent much time yourself in England?
Yes, I have been. Yes, I have spent quite a lot of time. I actually went there from South Africa and worked in London for 2 or 3 years before I went abroad for Reuters. And then when I came back, I spent time in England. Yes, I know England quite well. And of course, I read a lot about, that period that I write about was the period covered by books I read as a boy at school and later. So in some ways, it was very familiar to me.
Yes. Now, there are now 5 Madden books, but they each reflect quite a different social context and can be read as a standalone work. I get the feeling that you very much enjoy having that bigger canvas to play with. Is that perhaps the journalist at work?
Possibly. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but I was always interested in that. I'm interested in society, and if you write about England, especially during those years, you can't get away from the class system. So it's always the backdrop to my plays. To my books. And the thing is, in those books, the important thing is to think about how people talked to each other at that time, how they spoke to one another, which is very different from now. As you will have noticed, my books are entirely free of 4-letter words because people didn't use them very much then, and they certainly never used them in front of women.
That's right, absolutely. And this, well, if we're talking about the slightly risky, there's virtually no sex in them either that I can think of anyway, or very little.
There's a little sex in the first book because he has Madden and Helen do have a passionate physical attraction for each other, and there is 2 sex scenes in it. Other than that, I didn't have any sex scenes. I didn't want to put them in. I think they're by and large unnecessary these days. If people want sex, they can go online and look at porn. Why read about it? You don't have to read about it in books, particularly, I don't think. Anyway.
That's right. So you started out, with an idea of a trilogy or just a single book? How did it evolve?
It's very interesting. I started out with the idea of a single book, but when I finished it, I realized I had much more to say about Madden and Helen. I didn't want to leave it there. So I put to my publishers the idea of a trilogy, which they were quite happy with. But after I'd written 3, I got sort of subtle messages from them that they'd like more if possible, and I got sort of well into the family, into the whole family bit about the Maddens and the people around them. So I enjoyed writing more. I don't know how much longer they'll go on, to be honest, but I have got another one coming out, which is finished and in the hands of my publishers now.
So is that number 6?
That will be number 6, correct? Yes, yeah.
It's interesting because Robert McKee, the script writing guru, has said about historical stories that they need to be applicable to contemporary life. There has to be some theme or chord in them which has some resonation with people in their current world. And I think there has been a huge rise in popularity, particularly for Second World War historicals, but even First World War as well. What do you think the appeal is for this generation of reading about that period? I think, well, as you probably know, the First World War has been going through a period. It's slightly faded away now, which when it became very interesting to people in England, particularly in Britain, particularly, and also in America. I have a lot of readers in America. They, in some ways, I'm enjoying my books even more because they like reading about that time in England and the people there. I don't think I don't entirely agree with Robert McKee's thing. I think what the situations in your book have to be recognizable to people today. They must understand what problems the people faced then, how they had, how they confronted them and how they relate to their own lives. I think that's important, but they don't necessarily have to have a controlling idea that's reflected. I don't know. It's a form of words. Perhaps I sort of partly agree with them. Yes, I really try to set these people in the context of their own lives and show them dealing with their lives with problems that are not that different from problems today. You see, I think the First World War was a great hinge in history. There was a before and after, and we live in the after still, really, of the First World War in a sense. Oh, please expand on that thought a little more. So how do you see that as being the watershed?
There's a scene in the second book which writers have scenes they particularly like. Whether readers feel the same about them, I don't know. It's when Sinclair, the Madden's old friend and sort of former superior, is talking to the man at the Foreign Office, Philip Vane, who's in fact an intelligence man, not a diplomat. And Vane explains how things have changed since the war. He says, they're sort of no acting like gentlemen anymore. That everything has changed. And I think the Nazis were a symptom of that. Up to the First World War, there was a kind of a gentleman's way of fighting wars. One's read stories about how when pilots were shot down, they were given honourable funerals by the other side and this sort of thing. All that's gone away. It's become a much more savage and brutal world. So that's the hinge, I think.
Yes.
People behave better to each other before the war. But I think the war was so terrible, it actually changed something in human nature. I haven't actually said that in any of my books, but that's what I feel.
No, it's funny that you're referring to Bain, because when I was reading that book, it's one of those funny things, how when you read, you try and anticipate what might be coming. And I became quite convinced that Bain was the serial killer, and that he was somehow...
You were meant to.
And he was somehow, using his role as a way of sort of hiding away. And I carried on with this thought for quite a few chapters, was rather reluctant to follow you into the chap out in the hiding out in the fields. But yeah, it's funny how sometimes, and I think maybe even it's quite an interesting device that you kind of, almost a little bit of a red herring, that you kind of leave a few thoughts open for the reader that might be how it's going to go, and then it goes in quite a different direction. But
that's it. This is actually quite a standard device that we mystery writers use. You sort of like to set up possible other candidates, and he was an obvious one. He seemed like just the sort of man who might have a twisted sexual life.
Yes, he did.
And, but in fact, he was absolutely straight. That's quite fun to do that, actually, and then you sort of pull the rug from under the reader's.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
So how do you see Madden as having evolved over the series? I mean, in book 6, what age has he got to in book 6?
I've always been careful about the age. Let me work it out. I worked him out in sort of early 30s after finish. So in book 6, yes, I'm now in 1952. So that's 30 years. Yes, he's in his early 60s. I put him about 61, 62
yes.
now. You see, but he's still very fit. I've always kept him very fit. He's one of those people who sort of luckily doesn't get overweight and everything. He's kind of has a sort of vigorous life outdoors, and he's in good shape. The old chief inspector is getting quite old, and he in this latest book is really feeling his years. And I use all that about how you feel, and of course I like having the younger people in the books too. I like the daughter. I use her quite a lot, Lucy, who's probably like her mother was when she was a young woman. That's to say, very willful and strong-willed and wanting to do things her way. And it's I can play it well against Madden, who adores her, of
yes.
course. And there's putty in her fingers one way or another. Yeah.
I can tell just by the way you're talking about them that you really enjoy these characters.
Yes, I've enjoyed them very much, writing about them. They become real. The thing about writing is that you become these people start filling your life while you're doing the book, and they become almost like real people. They're in a way your company, and you wonder what they're going to do next. You're sort of not always sure, and you have to sort of see how the story evolves.
Yes, that's right. Look, turning from specific books to a wider look at your career, has there been one thing you've done more than any other that's been the secret to your success as an author?
I can't. I really don't know how to answer that, Jenny. It's I think that I write. As you know, my books have a slightly old-fashioned tone to them, and that's quite deliberate. I wanted them to sound like the kind of books that might at that period by a writer, rather than to give them a sort of modern sound at all. So I can't think of any single reason why I think people like reading about periods of history that are quite recent, are quite recent and can relate to. Mind you, they also like reading about earlier things. I, for instance, love Hilary Mantel's books about the Tudors, Henry VIII, and I find them absolutely engrossing and wonderful. Yeah.
Yes, and even, I mean, I've just in the last few days become aware, I don't know if you know an author, Lindsay Davis, who's done a series of mystery novels set in ancient Rome. She's got this hero, Falco.
Yes, I do. I've actually met her once or twice, I think, and I read 2 or 3 of the early books and really liked them. I haven't read any more, not because I went off. I just, there are so many books to read. You can only read so many. But I think she's very good.
Yes, that's right. So I must say that I enjoy being able to jump back to a period like that as well. It's really fun. So
they, have to be done very well, as she does, to actually make them work. Some of the ones pushing detectives back in the old days don't work very well for me, but those do. Those work very well.
Yes, yes. And you mentioned earlier about some of your postings with Reuters. And I mean, I was just starting out in journalism in those years, and it seemed to me to be just the most amazing thing to be in Washington during the Kennedy years, or to be in Saigon at the start of the Vietnam War. Have you ever been tempted to set novels in those periods and actually draw on that personal experience?
No, I haven't actually, Jenny. One of the reasons is I think if I did it, I would do it in a Graham Greene like way, who when I was a young man was my actual hero writer. I can tell you about that in a minute if you like.
Yes.
I wouldn't do that. I think you have to know another culture really well to set a book in it. For instance, I wouldn't set a book in America, though I know America quite well from my movie, but I wouldn't do that because I think I'd get so many things wrong. What I have done a couple of times, what I'm doing in the book I'm working now, which is not a Madden book, is bringing in a young American to Britain, London, and seeing the way she reacts to being in a country which is both familiar and not entirely familiar with her. I think you can do it that way, if you see what I mean. But I'd be very hesitant about actually setting any books, even though Greene did them brilliantly. But he always did them in a certain way with the wonderful characters he had, who were always fighting with God in one way or another. Yes.
Yes, yes. And nothing that would be based in South Africa from your...
No, I wouldn't. I left it a long time ago. I don't know the country well anymore. I just decided I always wanted to escape from South Africa. There was a kind of dead hand in life there. I lived during the apartheid times there, and I didn't. I felt this was not where sort of real life was going on. Of course, it was in a different way. I just wanted to get away, and I got away. And I sort of go back to visit. I have to see my sister and members of my families quite regularly there. But no, I couldn't write a book set in South Africa now. I'm far too much out of touch to do that.
Yes, that's probably one country that has changed hugely in the last 40 years, utterly, probably unrecognizable.
It is. Well, it is unrecognizable. I like the way it's unrecognizable. I like the way that now, Johannesburg. I don't like Johannesburg at all, but it's buzzing with sort of energy, and it's lovely to see all the mixing of races. This is one of the things I like about London now. When I first went there, it was almost a lily white town. There were blacks around, but you didn't see them very much. Now, if you travel the tubes in London or anywhere, it's what a mix of ethnic mix it is. I love it, actually. I think it's terrific.
Yes. So just reverting a little bit to the Robert McKee idea a weeny bit about a controlling idea, there's the other idea about a core story that writers tend to write the same story in different guises. I wonder if you've got any agreement with that, and if you have, what would your core story be, do you think?
Yes, I know that it's often said, writers write the same story. There's some truth in it, but I can't think of a core story. I mean, if you're writing mysteries, then you have in mind obviously a mystery. You set up a situation where one or more people is murdered, and you want to find out who did it, and that sort of thing. So, but that's just the framework of the book. I don't have in mind that sort of core story. I don't think. No, I think I can't really give you an answer on that. I don't feel I have that idea really.
Maybe something like that. justice somehow is always found in one way or another, that people get, I don't know.
I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I'm not sure justice is always found. I don't think, I think there's the law, and then there is justice, and the law doesn't always reflect justice. I don't think. I think justice is something else.
Yes.
Madden has in fact a horror of violence, and the interesting thing about him as a character is that, as the chief inspector points out in this last book I've written, he's talking to his daughter. He's talking to Madden's daughter and saying that, of course, your father was a tremendously good detective, but he hated actually anything to do with sort of violent death and everything. So for him, there was always a tug in different directions. That to my mind makes him interesting.
Yes, yeah. The series is called The Joys of Binge Reading because I was taken by this idea of how we are so attracted now to the instant gratification thing, and people buy digital books online and read a whole series over a week in the same way that they consume Netflix on TV. I don't know if you've ever been that sort of binge reader, but what are your reading tastes, and are there people that you might have binge read in the past?
Yes, I wouldn't say it was binge reading, but I sort of have. I absolutely have had favourite writers in the past. As a child, my absolute hero was Kipling. The Jungle Books were my Bible. I thought they were wonderful. He also happened to be a terrific writer, Kipling, so that was a good start. As I got older and sort of grew up and then finished school and everything, I became a great fan of Evelyn Waugh's books. I loved them. I read them all. And I read them all several times. I think he was a superb writer, even if he was a peculiar man. And then I moved on to Graham Greene, and I would say Graham Greene is probably the writer I admired most for the longest period. I thought as a storyteller and as a way of describing place and character in the most economical way, he was a complete master. And if you read, I don't know if you read him at all, Jenny, but if you read him again now, some of his best books, you'll be amazed what a good writer he was. And when I first went and wrote my first book in Crete, I think it was kind of very Graham Greene kind of thing. I had to get him out of my system, and I managed to do that with this book. I've never been tempted into that again, but I thought he was a wonderful writer in his way, and that's nothing to do with his views about religion, which were less interesting to me. It was just as a craftsman, I thought he was terrific. I managed to meet him once and have lunch with him, but he was very, and we talked about Havana, because of course Our Man in Havana is a lovely book, as he said there. And we talked a little bit about Havana, and I'd been there, but I couldn't really get anything out of him much. But anyway, that's my Graham Greene story for you. Now, as I say, I like Hilary Mantel very much, and I was a huge fan of Penelope Fitzgerald. I thought she was the best writer in England when she was alive. Alas, she's no longer with us. But as I grow older, I read less of modern fiction. I read quite a lot of biography and history, and I reread a lot of old books, classics, and other books that I'd liked in the past, because I think it's quite a feature of growing older that you do this. Anyway, that's my reading.
Great. Yes, look, I read Graham Greene so long ago that I have really almost forgotten, so it would be great to go back to them. Do tell us just about the circumstances of that lunch. How did it come about?
Well, it's very peculiar. I have a cousin who was an actress married to an agent, and the agent had got the rights for one of Greene's last books, which was called The Honorary Consul. It wasn't one of his best, incidentally. He got the movie rights through a director who knew Greene well. And needless to say, I made some money out of a book I wrote years ago called Snatch. It was bought for a movie. So he asked me if I could lend him some money to get hold of the script, which I did unwisely. Never lend anyone any money for buying movies. You never get it back. And he said, "What can I do in return?" I said, "Well, I like to have lunch with Greene." So me and this director, whose name was Peter something, I can't remember. We had lunch in Soho, and there was Graham Greene, very tall, rather elegantly dressed and unusually dressed, somewhat silent. You couldn't get much out of him. But anyway, I had lunch with my hero, so there it is.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Circling around from the beginning again, at this stage in your career, if you were starting out all over again, What, if anything, would you change?
Not much, I think. I wouldn't have started writing fiction earlier than I did because really I didn't have anything to write about. I think you have to learn a bit about life and experience it a bit before you can, if you're thinking of writing about fiction. And I think being a journalist does actually get you around the world. And you meet some very interesting, odd and unusual people. I mean, I could tell you about how I was taken to a baseball game by Castro, but I won't bore you with that now. But
no, that sounds great.
Yes, and things like that. And you meet a whole lot of different people. What you want to be if you're a writer, I think, is you've got to be curious, always curious, and you've got to be a good listener, and of course a good observer. But all those things also have to do with being a journalist. But in fact, writing journalism and writing fiction are two very different things. And I had to, as it were, unlearn the craft that I'd learned as a journalist and get into the business of writing fiction, which is very different.
How would you, in a nutshell, explain the difference in your experience? What was the difference that you had to take an approach between your journalism and your fiction?
Well, I was a very particular kind of journalist in the sense that I was a wire service journalist working for Reuters. Reuters wanted the news reported clearly, quickly, clearly, so that everyone could understand it. And stories were crafted in a certain way. The opening paragraph had to seize the reader's attention, and then you went through the story, as it were, and summed up in the end. It was rather like learning to make a table or a lampshade or something like that. It was craft. Once you get into the business of writing fiction, you're actually aiming for something quite different. You're looking for mood, character, and the story, of course. And you've got to blend all those together. It's actually quite different from journalism.
Yeah. So what is next for Rennie the writer? You mentioned that you're working on something that doesn't involve Madden. Can you talk about that?
No, I wanted a break from Madden. I did this book, which is in the hands of my publishers, which incidentally you might like to know is called The Decent Inn of Death, from the Chesterton poem, about before the Romans came to Rye.
Oh,
Did
yes.
you get that?
Yes.
and the last verse is, what is it? I can repeat it to you, I think. My friends, we will not come again to ape an ancient rage, or stretch the folly of our youth to be the shame of age, but walk with clearer eyes and ears this path that wandereth, and see undrugged in evening light the decent inn of death.
Terrific.
It refers to age, growing older and everything, which is not to say that either Madden or Mr. Sinclair necessarily die, but it's sort of getting older,
Yes.
Closer to the end.
Yes.
Sorry, what was your question again?
So the one that isn't about Madden,
it isn't about Madden. Yeah, this is one that is actually contemporary. I wanted to do a contemporary book, slightly prompted by the idea that the world is so horrible at the moment, at least the people running it, that I ought to try and write a book that was of our time and everything. And I had an idea in mind for some time and put it aside because I couldn't get I couldn't find what Hitchcock used to call the MacGuffin. The thing that set the story going, which is either a murder or a diamond just stolen or something like that. And then I got the idea of the MacGuffin, which I won't tell you because it comes at you just because as the book is going, you actually don't learn what it is for until you're quite well into the book. So I won't tell you what it is.
No, don't.
Perhaps you read it one day and you'll find out.
I think you're very brave to write contemporary. I mean, I've just been doing some historical mystery fiction, but I'm a bit scared about trying to do contemporary because even at my stage, I'm not so confident about how to write much younger people with the way that they use social media and all the rest. It's a world that is quite hard to reach back into, isn't it?
You don't have to tell me. It's one of the reasons. I'd forgotten to tell you that. One of the reasons I wrote back in time was because I realized that the technological change and behavior among people prompted by social media and everything is so quick now that by the time you write it, it's out of date and everything. So I've stayed away from it completely because I'm older and B, part of the word's a complete mystery to me. But I thought of a way of doing this book, of actually avoiding that. People have smartphones and all the rest of it, but actually staying away from social media and everything by actually devising a different plot. But I'd absolutely take your point entirely. I have stayed away from it for that reason too. And if it doesn't work, this book, I shall probably I shall probably sit down and write another Madden,
Yeah, that's great. It's wonderful that you still are. Are you going to be writing as long as you possibly can? It's something you just love to do.
Well, it's also, it's what you do, isn't it? You get up in the morning and you have another paragraph to write, another page to write. You probably the same, are you? Do you have that feeling?
Yeah, I was going to ask you if
I'm no longer doing it, what's the point of getting up anymore?
I imagine you're also someone who doesn't believe in writer's block.
I do, but I believe it can happen, actually. I had quite a long block, actually, between writing my first book. Then I had a second book and then another block. And don't ask me why, because people have asked me and I don't have an answer, Yes, I do believe it, but I don't know exactly what it is. You just don't know what you're going to write or what you want to write. I think it does. It doesn't exist for me now anymore. I can't see myself being blocked anymore. I'm too old for it. If I want to sit down and write something, I'll write it. It may work, it may not work. Maybe it's the fear of something is not going to work, and you have to overcome that fear. I don't know. But I don't have it anymore. Some books people like, some they don't. So what else? That's the way things are.
Yes.
I'll keep on writing as long as I can.
Wonderful. So you did mention before we started chatting here that you're not really one for social media yourself, but if people want to follow you, they can go to your website, can't they?
Yes, they can. Yes, I did it with the Authors Guild in America. So I think if they Google my name, they'll get my website.
We'll put the link in. What I do with these interviews is that I turn each one. We get a full transcript that's published online, and we mention all the links to the authors and the people that have been discussed so that people can go to that as a resource and find the links if they're interested in following through. So we'll make sure that your website is there for those who might be interested.
Okay, thank you. That's very nice. Good.
So we've come to the end of our time, Rennie. We've had a lovely chat. I so appreciate it, and I love your stories. We could talk all night, I think, actually.
It was very nice talking to you, Jenny, and good luck with your writing. I didn't know about your name as a writer, but I am aware of it now, and I shall get hold of a book of yours quite soon.
Oh, look, that's so sweet. Look, I'm a fiction writer as of September the 1st, so it's very new.
Ah, okay. I'll keep an eye. What's the name? Title?
The title is Poisoned Legacy for the first one.
I saw that on your email. Yes, okay. Very nice talking to you anyway.
Lovely. Thanks a lot. We'll catch up soon. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Joys of Binge Reading podcast. You can find all the details and links for this episode at www.thejoysofbingereading.com. We'd love to hear your comments and suggestions for who you'd like us to interview next. And if you enjoyed the show, take a moment to subscribe on iTunes or a similar provider so you won't miss out on future guests. Thanks for joining us, and happy reading.
The Joys of Binge Reading podcast is put together with fantastic technical help from Dan Cotton and Abe Raffles. Dan is an experienced sound and video engineer who's ready and available to help you with your next project. Seek him out at dcaudioservices@gmail.com. That's D for Daniel, C for Charlie, audioservices@gmail.com, or check our show notes. He's fast, he takes pride in getting it right, and he's great to work with. Our voiceovers are done by Abe Raffles, another gem of sound and screen. Abe has 20 years of experience on both sides of the camera/microphone, as a cameraman director and also as a voice artist and TV presenter. I think you'd agree that his voice is both light-hearted and warm. He is super easy to work with no matter what the job. You'll find him at Abe, A-B-E, at pointandshoot.co.nz. As I say, the full details in the show notes on the website. That's it for now. Thanks for listening. Hopefully see you next week. Bye.